What's going on, folks? It is week 3, and we've been ushering you through the AWS Cloud Practitioner certification just through real life conversation, really. And we had an opportunity to kind of look at some services, and we'll continue to do that. But I like this field. What about you, Coach? I like to kind of have this real talk conversation with folks.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things. I think it is such an easy flowing conversation. I love the fact that I feel like you're coming in, everyone's coming into my living room, right?
Yeah.
Granted, this is not my living room, but that's what it feels like. It feels like we're just having a conversation with friends and just getting them to understand, you know, what they can do, right? What is achievable just by exploring this conversation, just by giving these tips and suggestions and these resources and saying, hey, you know what, you can do it. Right? That's really what it boils down to. So let's jump
Absolutely.
into it.
We got you all folks geared up to understand the shared responsibility model. After that, we talked about a little bit of identity and access management. So we hovered around security a little bit, gave you an overview of all of the domains. And now we're kind of in domain 3. We're bleeding into like domain 3 and 4 now, just to cover some services. And for one, before we get into those services, I remember when I got into this industry, Coach, I started off as a support engineer. And you know what? Prior to that, I was like, I had a little bit of knowledge on computers, but not a whole lot. And that was about 10 years ago. And so when I had an opportunity to kind of troubleshoot hardware and software, I was kind of bumping my head against the wall, right? Trying to figure out how can I support these compute units. And I didn't really have a lot of technical background. My managers just kind of threw me into the fire, which I absolutely love now because after I got the technical background, it kind of paired well with experience, right? And I absolutely love that. And so more and more that I started dealing with IT over the years, I started going into more roles and responsibilities. Support engineer into a system administrator, kind of understanding how we deploy and understand how we monitor our entire system when you consider all the applications that we worked with. I was a data engineer, coach. I had an opportunity to work for a company by the name of Rockwood. And at that company, I had the responsibility of building out a database. And after getting the responsibility, kind of looking through all of the data, they trusted me to kind of organize the data on our customer resource management tools, our CRM that we dealt with. And even from then, I went into network operator and then into a network manager. And so after I got with AWS, I started looking at things like highly available architecture. I think that's one of the slides we're going to throw up on the screen in just a moment. And it really related to me because I could really go back for my entire journey from being a compute support engineer all the way out into a network manager to just kind of understand the fullness of it all. And again, when you're going into the cloud practitioner, do you really need to know all of these things in depth? No. So I don't even want to give it to you in that way. I want to give it to you in a high level overview.
Great point. Absolutely. And this is where I say, let's bring up this next slide here, but this is where I say, right, it's about terminology and understanding. And then let's dive into it, right? So it's when we can set the stage and give us the kind of the bird's eye view or the map in some cases where I think about it. Tell me where I'm going to go, right? Tell me where this conversation is going to go. And then that way I've got at least a roadmap, right? A roadmap to success is the way that I like to see it. And so then I can dive into what matters most to me at different points in that journey. Because everyone is along this journey in a way that makes sense to them, right? This is not about cookie cutter or you've got to go do this. And sure, we want a prescriptive path, everyone, there's a recipe to success, but we also need to meet you where you're at in this conversation. So let's jump into it.
Let's jump into it. Now, I remember one of the first things that I had to get familiar with on my day to day, and it was understanding the network. If I was going to troubleshoot things at work, I needed to understand how communication happened. And one of the things that you got to understand when you're jumping into that cloud practitioner is the network of things, I like to say. And so this purple outline of this entire diagram is what we call a virtual private cloud. And really, you can look at it as a space for you to connect these different virtual devices. If you can imagine walking into a workplace that has computers, you can imagine now this virtual private cloud, right? These are just devices all connected together for communication purposes, right? And so, I
And
have
I'll throw
yeah,
something in there, right? Right. So sometimes we come from a background of what we call on-prem or on-premises, right? And so this is an equivalent to a VLAN, right? A virtual local area network, and just translating the lingo, right? This is why I say it's about terminology and making it make sense based on what you are accustomed to or what you're.
Absolutely, absolutely. And now, if we're going to be making these connections, some of the connections that we're going to make are public, some of them will be private. And so, one of the understandings that you might get out of the cloud practitioner, if you go through the material, is that, hey, I got an opportunity to create some devices that can be connected to by way of the internet. I also have some other devices that maybe I don't want the internet to connect to, right? And so, you'll see in this space here, in this diagram, some green boxes, you'll see some blue boxes, and we're just trying to indicate those different areas of your network. And I think when you consider the cloud practitioner exam, it kind of stops there, right? You really don't need to know more than that to get the questions right as far as VPCs and what we are now describing are subnets, right? As subnets. If you can understand that if you go for that exam and you get a question about the general network where your devices will kind of be plugged into, then that's the VPC, right?
Okay. Great point.
Yeah. And so what do I want to plug into my VPC? Now, first, I got a question for you. Like, what are you doing here at AWS, right? You're most likely running applications, and I remember one application I used to work on at work. It was called the Brain. We call it the Brain. And simply put, there were salespeople who would go out to a customer's home at my previous job, and the salesperson would sell that job to the customer. They had an iPad with them, and then they would kind of select the items that they wanted to choose, and then that information would come right back into our environment, and we use the website. We had to host that website on a compute unit. That's what I mean by our environment. The compute unit was right there in our location, on-prem. And so as we look to the diagram here, we see a word called app server. And you see that word, we're just describing a server, a compute unit, right? So no matter where you are in your walk, you might be fairly new to IT. You might understand on-prem devices versus virtual devices, or you might not. But right now I'm here to tell you that this orange square, right, that's being indicated right here on the screen, is indicating a server. And we're placing this virtual device here in our diagram, hopefully to run an application. So our application most likely will sit on this server. We'll call it app server. Right? And so, Coach, we got two app servers